and welcome to another edition of Headlocks and Headphones. I am Stuart Murphy, the owner of CWF, and the reason that this show gets the ratings it does is because I am the biggest draw in Headlocks and Headphones history. A few things to address today. The first thing is we clearly have a mole within CWF, and we are working hard to find out who this is. Now, this is obvious for the fact that the theme song for show 1 and the name for show 1 has been revealed without my say-so. And it's been revealed by Headlocks and Headphones and not by CWF, and this angers me very, very much. A couple other things we need to address is we do have a venue and a date confirmed for show 1. By now you're aware, show 1 is now called CWF Fresh Start, and that will take place at Jordan Hill Sports Hall in Glasgow on June 19th, 2021. Obviously this date is dependent on COVID restrictions, but we are confident the show will go ahead as and when it is planned. Ticket information will be released very shortly on where you can pick up yours. Also, we have a big announcement to make regarding show 1, and that's we already have a participant in our 8-man tournament. This man is extremely talented. This man is going to be the new face of Scottish wrestling, the new king of Scottish wrestling, if you will. And this man is extremely handsome. And that man is, of course, me. I am the first participant in the 8-man tournament. Why, you ask? Well, it's very, very simple. I have a point to prove. To everyone, I have a point to prove. I'm making this announcement before the mole can make this announcement. I'm staying ahead of him. He didn't know about this, because no one in the CWF backroom team, except for myself, knew I was making this announcement. I don't like the fact that Martin Anderson, despite the fact the past few shows you've seen we've put our differences well and truly in the past, I do not like the fact that he is announcing all of this stuff he gets from the mole without clearing it with me first. That will be addressed, was meant to be addressed today, but as you can see, he's running scared of what I might say to him after revealing that from the mole. Well, Martin, we'll speak next week. You might like what I have to say, you might not like what I have to say, but we will do this in a professional manner. Until then, I'll see you all later, and you can admire the face of the new king of Scottish wrestling.
So hello, welcome. This is Headlocks and Headphones, the pre-Christmas special. The one thing that's quite interesting, when it comes up to Christmas, wrestling's always a bit throwaway. It's a bit random for them to have a pay-per-view on the 20th of December, but we're going to discuss that very quickly later on in the show. And to be honest, I tend to kind of skip out of wrestling at the winter break. It's what I call it. I'm a football fan, and I skip wrestling, much like football tends to be skipped a little bit as well. So I haven't really been keeping up with the product this week. So I watched something else instead. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. But as you're getting ready for Christmas, hopefully you've got everything bought, everything's wrapped, nobody's arguing yet, and hopefully you've figured out whatever bloody tier you're meant to be in, heading into Christmas and then coming out of Christmas, and you've got all your stuff ready to go. But whatever happens, have a good Christmas. We do have a Christmas special that's going to be released on Christmas Day. So if you are bored later on Christmas night, feel free to have a look. We kind of go over the year in wrestling, and we talk about some of the things that have happened. And we talk about it with somebody who isn't a massive wrestling fan. They are fans, but they are not tuning in every week to watch the garbage. I mean, the product that most of the companies are putting out. So coming up this week, we're going to be looking at the wrestling news. We're going to be doing a little bit of a preview for TLC. We also have an announcement from CWF. In fact, we have more than one announcement from CWF. If you're following our social media, you'll see that I announced the name of the first CWF show, which is CWF Fresh Start. There is a very cool theme song we're going to discuss later on. And on top of that, we are also apparently going to get an additional announcement from Murphy. But until I see that video, I'm not going to know what that is. Now, in terms of of what we normally do, because we normally talk about the product that week, AEW, NXT, WWE, and then we kind of dot in and out from Impact and NXT UK and stuff as well. So that leaves a big gaping hole in today's show. But never fear. I sat and watched 3 Survivor Series last night into this morning, and I've got a lot I want to say about them. So we're going to take a little bit of a flashback in time, and we're going to see the relevance to what's happening now in the world. At least the wrestling world, because it's not COVID related, because ours talking about that any more than we already have. The wrestling news. Every week I say this, but this is the part I like the most. It gives me a chance to kind of gossip and talk about wrestling. If anybody else out there would like to join in and do some wrestling gossip, please feel free. After Christmas, we're happy to have guests on the show talk about wrestling, because you know what? I don't like when people agree with me. I like the ability to try and explain my side of things and they can explain theirs. Some people don't like that. Certainly, some people involved in running wrestling companies don't like to be in debates about opinions. But we'll move on very quickly. Do you know what? No, I'm actually going to talk about this. So it's come to my attention from the mole within CWF. I'm going to put this in the wrestling news section because I feel it's valid. One of the people involved in the speaking out movement has been involved with a private group for his trainees and has basically been saying that this year's going to be great. The idea by this wrestler is that everything's going to return to normal for them. And I think it should be known that it better not return to normal. You know, if CWF is going to be involved with people who are alleged to have done things as part of the speaking out movement, certainly no, I won't be even talking to the owner. I won't be involved in any way, shape, or form, because this is one of the ways that we have to stand up and be accounted for. Now, this is the part the CWF mole came to me with, was that somebody who's involved in the speaking out movement reached out to CWF looking for a job, looking for a chance to work a show, because when they tried to run their first show last year in November, this American talent, who I'm not going to give the name, but if I was to tell you this person was involved in a lawsuit right now, you might work out who that is, emailed and asked for work, and CWF rightly told this person where they could go and what they could stick where the sun don't shine. This is exactly what I want to see from wrestling promotions. I know All Star Wrestling have booked people who've been linked with the speaking out movement. I know that I've mentioned this a few times in recent weeks, but I am pissed with the amount of times I see people saying that everything will return to normal. If it does, then I think British wrestling especially is in for a lot of trouble. A lot of the people who have allegations against them, I've seen, they think it's going to return to normal. And let me name some names for a start. The person who had a private group who was talking about everything returning to normal in the new year, and they dislike all the drama was kid fight. Ross feels that, you know, this next year coming up will be a chance for him to get back to normality. Or you have Travis Banks going on Twitch or whatever streaming station he was on and using his old wrestling promo pictures. If you are part of the speaking out movement and you happen to think that things are going to return to normal, then I know certain companies aren't going to care about booking you. They're going to book you because not everybody's seeing what's going on. Not everybody's on the internet watching TV shows and watching documentaries and looking at the wrestling news sites. That's something that I do because, you know, I have a lot of need to have downtime in between doing essays and exams and all that. So I see all this stuff, but I know a lot of people aren't. But I also know there's Scottish-based companies who are booking people involved in the speaking out allegations. I know that there's English companies. I'll name All Star Wrestling directly, who have directly booked talent linked with the speaking out allegations. And for me, it's, if we're going to talk about news this week and throw these things out there, let's talk about that serious thing. If you're a wrestling promoter and you book somebody who's had allegations as severe as taking pictures of schoolgirls outside school, or sexual allegations made against you during training, then you don't deserve to be in this business. And if anybody isn't aware of who these people are, look them up. These allegations are out there. You can see them. Just this past week, another wrestling promoter found out for being the guy who just wants to do things with underagers. I mean, it's sickening. And quite frankly, this is meant to be fun. The whole point of wrestling is we're meant to enjoy ourselves. It's meant to be something to escape reality, not just spread more of this. Okay, let's try and take a step back and talk about just the news, because that seems like it's going to be somewhat more interesting and somewhat more palatable than listening to somebody involved in wrestling being so upset that they never want to return because Kid Fight Ross is going to try and get bookings next year and stupid promoters are going to book him. It's not like he's a massive draw anyway. It's a little bit different if it's somebody like The Rock, but it's Kid Fight. If he's selling you 1,000 tickets, I'll be shocked. Anyway, let's move on. The Rock, according to TMZ, has just had a rare trading card of his from when he was in football sell for $14,000, give or take a few pennies. The card is from his time at the University of Miami, which is from 1994. Bumblebee produced a set of football cards featuring players from the team such as Warren Sapp and Ray Lewis. The 24 card sheet was released during the Orange Bowl, and it happened on a rainy day. Because of this, most people who were given these cards threw them out and didn't keep them. However, there are a few people who kept them, and one person managed to get 14 grand for trading cards. I'm a massive trading card fan. I managed to pick up some old WCW ones from the 90s, some old Pro Set football cards from the 90s that were actually used on the Football Daft podcast as well, because I sent them. So trading cards are cool. To think that there may be one that's worth that amount of money in the collection that I have is pretty damn cool. Now, Paul Heyman took to Twitter on Saturday announcing that he doesn't think he and Kevin Owens are meant to get along. And he said, some people were meant to sit next to each other. Some people were meant to just not get along. Some people were not meant to get along sitting next to each other. Now, what's kind of interesting here is you have to believe that Paul Heyman really likes Kevin Owens, this character that's able to speak for themselves. So this is a work being reported as real. And the interesting thing here for me is that wrestling news sites pick up on these stories and publish them. And it makes you wonder, because what they're doing here is they're basically taking what is essentially a working tweet and trying to make it into something real. And this for me is almost as bad as just making stuff up. Now, if we're going to talk about making stuff up, let's talk about making stuff up. Recently, the allegations from TalkSport, Wrestle Talk, and various other places, is that WWE have been told to make their product more violent and adult orientated, and apparently it's more of a return to the Attitude Era. Again, we keep hearing this every now and again, and Dave Meltzer has since come out and said it's entirely clear these people would not have any contact or access to the people who would be making these comments. These comments would be going, if they were being made, between WWE and the USA Network, which would mean they'd be going to Bruce Pritchard, they'd be going to Vince McMahon. And the likelihood of Bruce Pritchard or Vince McMahon speaking to the likes of Wrestle Talk or Talk Sport is very slim. It's another example of where wrestling journalists, I use that term loosely, wrestling journalists seem to just take the slightest little thing and be able to make it what it is. It was the lowest rated Raw last week. And that led to people basically saying, oh, they need to return to this, they need to return to that. It's very easy to turn around and say, well, yeah, the network said that they need to return to the product that drew the greatest ratings. Actually, that's probably a legitimate comment that somebody at the network said. So they can't be accused of being outright liars, but certainly to accuse the Wrestle Talk and Talk Sport guys, who seem to be the ones that report a lot of this information, are lying, would be a bit harsh. Perhaps they've been misinformed. Somebody's telling them this stuff if they're not just outright making it up. And let's not assume they're making it up. So it's unfortunately, it's hard to know what to believe, particularly when they report stuff without telling you it's part of the storyline for the TLC pay-per-view. That would be the Paul Heyman, Kevin Owens issue. Now, let's move on very quickly. Maria Kanellis is returning to Ring of Honor. She joins her husband, Mike Bennett, and they are looking forward to something interesting. So in January, ROH Ring of Honor take the experience to the next level of fan engagement by empowering the members of the Honor Nation to make their voices heard. Now, it's not a single event, it's a movement. Fans are encouraged to join the Ring of Honor, the Experience Facebook group, to share their thoughts and opinions about all things Ring of Honor. Which outside talent should Ring of Honor book? Which stars should be getting title shots? What match stipulations do you want to see? On the surface, sounds great. In reality, this is going to be a very confusing, very misused concept, because what you can't do is just have the fans book your product, because they will want to see, and they maybe don't want to see this exact thing, but they're going to want to see the most extreme, the most over-the-top stuff on every show. And they're going to want to see their favorites get title shots. And it just so happens, if, like we see in political polls, if you organize people enough, that would mean certain people would always get title shots. So for me, it's an interesting idea to hear what the fans want. But if you just look at social media, you'll see what the fans like and don't like. Having an official group for this is a good PR stunt, but I don't think it's going to deliver anything more than a PR stunt, or perhaps a vehicle for Maria Kanellis to be the face of something for Ring of Honor that isn't wrestling. Which, isn't entirely a bad thing to have Maria Kanellis in your product. Now, let's move on about somebody being on the product. Grilling JR had some comments about Sting, and I just want to talk about them because I'll read the quote out, because for me, I think there's a lot of questions about what Sting's role is going to be in AEW, and I personally am not entirely confident that I care. When Sting came out, I didn't pop the way everybody else seemed to. When Sting came out and cut the promo on Cody Rhodes, it was 10 minutes of nothing, and now we're hearing rumors that there's going to be a cinematic match with Darby Allin, which just... I mean, I can't even give you words to describe how frustrating that is. It's pointless. But let's go with the quote from JR. What's really going on is Tony Khan reached out, hired Sting to a multi-year deal. He's going to have a variety of roles. I don't know what they are exactly, but they'll be in a creative capacity to where he's a character on television. There's a lot of ways to be a character on TV that's been accepted by the audience nowadays that doesn't include wrestling every week. I don't think anybody should wrestle a match every week on television. I think it's the kiss of death. You want to keep your talent fresh. You don't want to overexpose them. There's a lot of great things Sting can do. When he made his debut, he didn't say a word. He looked guys in the eye, and he looked the three guys in the face. I'm on board with most of what JR said, though. I agree. If people are wrestling every week, it is quite damaging. There is the old school format with the A show and the B show, where somebody would wrestle on the A show and then have a promo on the B show. And then the following week, you'd swap it around. Because the idea was that the A show was in every market, and then the B show wasn't in every market. But if somebody couldn't catch the A show in a market where both shows were available, they could catch the B show and kind of have the story. So I like that. I like the idea of people not wrestling every week. That's great. This idea of overexposure. AEW Dark has 13 matches on it this week. AEW are going to be adding a second show, which by appearances is aimed at not being AEW Dark, which is they've essentially said is their developmental, and not being Dynamite, which is their A show. So essentially, it's a B show, which is what everybody else would call it. How is that not going to lead to overexposure? Because if you're arguing that some of the talent that isn't on the A show is going to be on the B show, then AEW Dark becomes essentially a bunch of trainees. And if you then move those trainees, it just becomes overexposed. You already have to watch AEW Dark, Dynamite, being the elite, and 37 hours of weird, boring, poorly edited, poorly produced content by friends of the Young Bucks. And I don't have the time to invest in that. Some people clearly do. And the problem with that is a lot of people. Let's talk about this because you know what? We're having a Christmas break next week. So let's talk about this because we won't really get much of a chance. A lot of people have been very critical of a certain WWE wrestler who made comments about being pro-Trump. He made racist comments, and I can't condone those. And it's not that I'm condoning the Trump comments, but the same people I see going after a certain member of the Forgotten Sons are the same fans who crawl all up the Young Bucks' ass, who crawl all up Cody Rhodes' ass, and are in love with Chris Jericho. Hate to break it to you all, but all of them are Trump voters. Worse, you have details about the Young Bucks and their lack of, what's the word? The lack of support for minority groups. And I don't just mean skin color. I mean sexuality, gender, race, everything. Look it up. These stories are out there. There's some people who've said the issues between Booker T and the Young Bucks were race related. There's issues involving a certain transgender wrestler and the Young Bucks. So these stories are out there. And the problem is that we seem very willing to forget them when some people do it and not so willing to forget when other people do it. And that's an interesting point to look at. There is the old, it's not quite a joke, but it's a very valid point. How talented do you have to be for allegations against you to be ignored? Gary Glitter, for example, completely removed from history. On the other hand, there are known pedophiles in the music industry whose music is still being released, and there is certain people who married their underage cousin and his music is still played and still in movies. How talented, where's the line of talent? I mean, if the Young Bucks were slightly less talented, would we be unhappy that they were Trump voters, or are they just talented enough that they can vote for who they want? Which, by the way, I have people in my life who vote for the SNP, the Scottish National Party here in Scotland. I think it's crazy, but they think I'm crazy for who I vote for. So it doesn't make us fall out. And wrestling fans sometimes forget that. I know this is getting serious, but we'll try and avoid being serious all the time. So AJ Styles was speaking with Alex McCarthy of Inside the Ropes. By the way, if you've not watched this guy's stuff, did not like him. When I first caught his stuff, hated him. I thought he came across awkward. The interviews were really bad quality, but I realized it wasn't that the interviews were bad quality. It was more to do with the fact that I was expecting something else. What he's delivering is great. The problem was my perception of it rather than what he was producing. But so AJ Styles was speaking about his Boneyard match at WrestleMania 36, and he said, well, as far as the match and him thinking that was going to be his last, I don't think he knew, nor did I, that it was the one that needed to be ended on. It was just, it kind of happened. And, I literally called him a month after WrestleMania and said, listen, I need to know if you're done. Well, he never called me back because I think he was afraid, and I tried to talk him into one more. He did it the right way. He did it in his own terms. He didn't have to do it because of an injury or something else. He's the one who said, you know what, I'm okay with ending it right here. And after his match with Goldberg and after some of the poor section of events that he's been involved in over the past couple of years, to see him go out with something like that match with AJ Styles was like, I remember watching it thinking, this better be it. He's riding off into all the imagery was there. The flames behind him. He's firing through the flames. He's driving off into the sunset. We had those images. They clearly constructed those images. And for me, that's a perfect way to end things. Certainly, I would be very happy if Undertaker never wrestled again. And it looks like he's very happy. Some of the interviews I've seen him doing, particularly hot ones and some of the wrestling related interviews, he's coming across really happy, not having the pressure of having to get ready for WrestleMania. So hopefully he'll be very, very happy in the coming months as he transitions into what looks like being his new role at the WWE Performance Center. Now, SmackDown superstar Wesley Blake took to Twitter to reveal that him and Sarah Lee, the former NXT superstar who was on Tough Enough, if I remember correctly, are expecting their third child together. He tweeted, "It came without ribbons, it came without tags, it came without packages, boxes, or bags. Our hearts grew 3 times the size when we found out baby number 3 on the way, due in July 2021. Now, congratulations. 3 kids is going to be hella stressful in that house, but you know what? I'm sure they'll do very well because they seem very happy, and that's the big thing. As long as you're happy, the kids come in, that's great. So let's move on to Matt Riddle, who apparently Vince McMahon doesn't understand him, and why would he? But it looks like Vince likes him, and there is a $400,000 per year contract with $50,000 for every Saudi Arabia appearance being lined up for him because his contract ends in August. Now, a lot of people have said he should go to AEW. There are allegations hanging over his head, which obviously cloud a lot of people's judgment. There's something there in the performer, I'm not quite sure what it is, because I want to punch him in his face, but I also want to sit and have a beer with him, so I can't quite work that one out. But it's going to be interesting to see, because I think he should remain in WWE and spend a little bit of time. Even if he was to sign a 2-year contract, that would still give him time to go to Japan with a little bit more acclaim and be able to deliver as far as the in-ring stuff he can do. The character stuff, he's always had this character that's kind of out there and different. So I'm intrigued to see what happens. I look at it as I think he's going to sign with WWE. He likes the fact that he's a WWE star. He said it himself. That was the dream. So I think if he was to just be there for a couple of years and leave, he would see that as not completing the job. I think he's a future world champion if the allegations that are against him are not something that he gets convicted for. And then obviously if he does, then there should be no contract there anyway. But it'd be interesting to see what happens with that. But if that stuff is sorted, then he's somebody who can be a world champion. Certainly somebody who you'd be happy to have going around doing interviews. And that heel turn when he eventually cuts his hair, wears a suit and wears shoes is going to be awesome. Now, talking of heel turns, Ted DiBiase's son, Brett DiBiase, was actually in court this week admitting to defrauding Mississippi's welfare agency. And Ann Wolf of Mississippi Today reported the developing story and shared that DiBiase, the son of WWE Hall of Famer Ted DiBiase, was one of 6 individuals who pled guilty to fraudulent statements, a crime which carries a maximum of 5 years imprisonment and a fine of $10,000 rather. Hinds County District Attorney Jody Owens, however, did state it's possible DiBiase will face 0 jail time. So apparently he returned $48,000 to inform, update, and educate in identifying opioid abuse. That was what his money that he'd fraudulently received was for. He was meant to do 24 training sessions on opioids, but they never occurred. Brett did not complete the training and now admits he kept the money. He has actually submitted $5,000 already, and the rest of that $48,000 will be returned. And it looks like in return for his statements, he's actually going to avoid jail time. So he turns snitch and gets off. He returns the money, but from what we understand, he's not going to be poor. His dad's a millionaire, right? I mean, that's real. That's not fake. Has to be real. Anyway, let's talk about something else that's a bit fake. The ratings between AEW and NXT. Now, everybody's talking about the demos and saying, well, AEW actually get more in the key demos than Raw do now, and NXT always gets beat by AEW. Well, one interesting thing that I pointed out in recent shows is the inconsistency in the ratings. But let's look at it this way. 200,000 people did not watch this week's AEW. Now, people will say, yes, but they beat NXT. The network should not be looking at whether they beat NXT or not. They should be looking at the fact that they lost 2 100,000 viewers. Yes, both shows' ratings are going up and down, and there's a little bit of an area where they're kind of going up and down within. But AEW lost 200,000 viewers in 1 week. Something has to be wrong if you're losing that many viewers. And for me, the problem comes down to inconsistent booking. And WWE, whilst their ratings are not beating AEW every week, they are within a consistent window. There is a little area where you can almost predict, if you watch NXT and the show's really good, you can predict what the high end of that number is going to be. And if you tune in and the show's a little bit lacking, you know roughly where that low number is going to be. If you've been looking at them as a person with statistics history, looking at statistics, you can kind of see the pattern from the quality of shows. And even ignoring the fact that, the NXT has different avenues where they broadcast. The network, for example, where we don't get those numbers. And the likelihood is a lot of the people who initially got the network got it for NXT. And chances are they still watching NXT because that's their pattern. So the reality is WWE are under no obligation to release those figures, and nor do I think they should. But what I think going into this, and you're allowed to disagree, again, you'd be wrong, is that NXT have the more consistent ratings out of the two. If your ratings are going up and down 200,000 every week, then there's something very, very wrong with how you're booking things. With NXT, yeah, they've had high end. They've had things go as high as 876,000, which was October 28th. And they've had other weeks where they've had very high numbers as well, and they've coincided with like Keith Lee winning the title and things like that. Whereas, September 9th, which was 1,016,000 viewers for AEW, which is great. But this was not long after having only 600,000 viewers, and you're thinking, well, clearly they've added 400,000 viewers. Clearly they haven't, considering they only had 806,000 viewers for December 16th, which means that those extra people who tuned in for 1 week decided not to come back. There's a reason why people choose not to come back. AEW have a very loyal fan base, not critiquing the product, not critiquing the fans. But if you lose 200,000 people in 1 week, there's got to be a reason for it. Now, let's look at a positive story about AEW. Brandy Rhodes and Cody shared with the world they're expecting their first child, apparently. If I remember correctly, I believe it was going to be July. But Cody and I are so excited and overwhelmed by this news. We've had 7 exciting years of marriage, worked together to grow our careers and our core at AEW from the ground up. And now here we are embarking on an incredible chapter. So that means the end of the in-ring stuff for Brandy, which we can all be thankful for. But at the same time, congratulations for having another pregnancy story this week. Now, one other new arrival that I think is probably pretty cool for most of us is that the WWE Hall of Fame isn't a physical building. There is one for the International Wrestling Hall of Fame, which is coming very soon. WWE apparently are building a real, genuine physical Hall of Fame in Orlando, Florida. Ric Flair was on ESPN's The Jump, and he said, WWE is actually in the process of building a Hall of Fame, a physical structure in Orlando. It's been delayed by COVID. They purchased the robe and wanted to put it in there. It would be something that I wore that they would display in the hall. Since forging a partnership with Full Sail University, WWE have actually turned Orlando, Florida into a home base for themselves. The Performance Center is there, and it's not only helped train the bulk of their talents, but also provided a house for most of the shows in 2020 due to the pandemic. So what's quite interesting is the Physical Hall of Fame, I think, is going to be a fly-in for many people. Certainly something that's going to be very cool if you're a wrestling fan to go in and see. I know Bruno Sammartino actually gave his title to WWE for the purposes of a physical Hall of Fame. There are many artifacts. They have a warehouse series on YouTube, which is worth checking out. You can see things like the Nitro letters and the stage sets, and there's various banners from WrestleManias and shows around the world, and they have stuff that isn't even WWE related. It's very, very cool. Now, we spoke about the speaking out movement at the start, one of the names that kind of went under the radar a little bit was Tyrus, George Murdoch. And he was being sued by former un-PC co-host Britt McHenry for sexual harassment. Now, Tyrus's lawyer called it a smear campaign at the time, and now there's an update. Several counts of the lawsuit against Fox Corporation were dropped, but the federal judge did not dismiss the case against Tyrus himself. So Murdoch argues that these allegations fall short of alleging harassment because McHenry does not allege any actual sexual advancement, or that he is propositioning Miss Henry or demonstrating a romantic interest in her, which, you don't have to demonstrate an interest in somebody in that way for something to be harassment. But U.S. District Judge Paul Engelmayer said in the filing, his communications as pled are readily construed to reflect sexual advances and propositions, albeit unusually crude and clumsy ones. In any event, Murdoch's legal premise is wrong, as the New York court does not require that the defendant have had any romantic interest in the plaintiff, but only that he subjected her to unwanted gender-based conduct. Now, this is something that pisses me off. His defense was that he wasn't interested in her. So why send the stuff you were? Let's look at some examples of what was being sent. I love ponytails and braids. You look amazing, and it's a real turn on. Not that you care, but I love it. I mean, that would make me feel uncomfortable. I love your legs. Fuck them, you're beautiful. I love that picture. Is it creepy how I look at you? FYI, you'll need those legs to escape from me in Montana, which, by the way, is probably the most creepy one. I please especially on your knees hotness. I'll show you what it means to be bad, Brittany McHenry. And the last one, dick pic coming in 5 seconds. So apparently that is not romantic interest. Certainly inappropriate. Certainly if you message that to anybody in a British workplace, you could be fired for that. That's harassment. Doesn't have a leg to stand on. And, if he is booked to appear on a TV show, or if he's booked to appear for a wrestling company, then that's another person you should go out your way to make sure they do not get rewarded. Make sure those ratings absolutely stink. But I don't want to end on a speaking out movement thing, because although it's a serious topic, let's move to something that isn't quite as serious. Now, this one is laughable, but probably not for the reasons that we should think. AEW have had more trouble establishing names for their events throughout this year. Now, Heel by Nature reported that AEW's trademark for Stadium Stampede has been suspended because WWE have registered Spring Stampede. There's also some legal wording that needs to be sorted out as well. Now, in layman's terms, the AEW filing for the trademark failed to argue why the company should be granted a wrestling-related mark for the word Stampede, as it's close to WWE's filing of the WCW pay-per-view. Additionally, bear in mind, WWE also technically, as far as they're concerned, own Stampede Wrestling. They certainly own the libraries. As of December the 7th, the filing has been suspended pending further action. On WWE's side of things, Spring Stampede mark was requested back in January 2019. It's not been approved due to identification of service issues. WWE has until March of next year to sort that out. Now, the Stadium Stampede was the match that happened in the empty arena that involved Matt Hardy, the Bucks, Kenny Omega versus the Inner Circle, which they've said they hope becomes a signature. I would absolutely 100% hope this does not become a signature. It was an absolute joke. I'm not going to critique the product too much, but it was an absolute joke. But they plan on running it again. So there you are. I mean, this pandemic's brought some really cool stuff. We've got to see some creative things from more companies than just WWE. WWE have a very high standard. But you've seen AEW do some things a little bit off the wall. You've seen Impact get a little bit creative. Ring of Honor have been producing stuff that's just out of this world, making it look like an actual contest rather than just sending people out to fight in matches and then filming stuff later on. They've actually put some real effort into how they build characters and stuff as well. But that is the wrestling news. Still to come in today's show, the announcement from CWF as to what's happening for show 1. And I talk not about the present product. Instead, I'm going to be talking about some old Survivor Series pay-per-views. So, of course, by the time that you see this show, the show will have happened. But let's do a little preview with some match predictions, and let's see how close I can get, because I'm recording this before the TLC pay-per-view, and it should be up before the TLC pay-per-view. So one of the interesting things that WWE have is these themed pay-per-views. Some of them are good, some of them are not. Certainly not a massive fan of the Money in the Bank one that they had this year, although they made the best of it, I suppose, when they did stuff at the WWE headquarters. Now, there's several storylines that's been taking place. There's the fallout from the Survivor Series, Team Raw, Team SmackDown. There's, of course, the Drew McIntyre story that's been taking place with Sheamus, which is going to hopefully lead somewhere interesting. But let's kind of go through the matches, talk about what's happening, and then hopefully we can kind of see who's going to win, who's going to lose. Some of them a bit easier to predict than others, I think. It's likely, based on the fact they've only advertised 6 matches, there will be more to come. But we have the New Day versus the Hurt Business, which will be Cedric Alexander and Shelton Benjamin. For me, I hope this is when they get the tag titles. I think Hurt Business with some gold around their waist, and by Hurt Business, I mean Cedric Alexander and Shelton Benjamin, would be great. I would love to see them get that. And you could actually lead to a little bit of animosity between Kofi Kingston and Xavier Woods coming out of that, which would be at least something different for them rather than just coming out and doing the positivity all the time. I'd love to see one of them turn heel. Sasha Banks versus Carmella. I think Sasha Banks has to retain that. I've never been a massive fan of the Carmella character, so I would really like to see Sasha Banks retain that one. Strangely, Roman Reigns versus Kevin Owens is not listed as the top match. For me, I think there's a very good story there. I certainly think that both being family men with slightly different outlooks on things, there's a lot of drama there. It looks like a TLC match for the Universal Championship. I don't expect there to be big falls for Roman Reigns. I think Kevin Owens may take something big. Certainly, in my head, I'm picturing him doing a dive and trying to do an elbow off the top of the top rope onto the announcer's table with Roman Reigns there. Roman moves, Kevin Owens gets scooped up. It's 1, 2, 3. But you never know with these things. I would think they wouldn't put the belt on Kevin Owens at this point. Nia Jax and Shayna Baszler versus Asuka, and to be determined. The chances are this looks like Charlotte Flair based on the fact that Nia Jax was the one that put Charlotte Flair out. It would be interesting to see if they would go a different route and call up somebody and give them a little bit of the rub. But it certainly makes sense. Charlotte's been away for a while. I know she's, from what she's been saying in interviews, she's chomping at the bit to get back and get back involved. So I would think that because it's for the Women's Tag Championship, I think Nia Jax and Shayna Baszler, if it's anybody other than Charlotte, they're going to retain. If it's Charlotte, I think Asuka and Charlotte will win those belts. And then we'll see the same dynamic with Asuka and Charlotte we've had with Nia Jax and Shayna Baszler. The Fiend Bray Wyatt versus Randy Orton in a Firefly Inferno match. Now, this one, I've not been massively enamored with the Randy Orton Bray Wyatt story this time. And I know a lot of people think it's really cool and they're very interested in where this is going because you've got the backstory. And I just think that the fact that they've got the backstory, this just seems almost forced. It seems too much like they're just trying to make a stipulation for the sake of it. I hate shows where almost all matches have stipulations because then it's almost like they mean nothing. Certainly when we had the Hell in a Cell and you had 2 Hell in a Cell matches, it isn't really as useful as having just one. or War Games, where you had 2 War Games matches. On this one, you have 2 TLC matches. We'll discuss the second one in a second. But I think Bray Wyatt needs this win. It's really going to help him if he gets this win over Randy Orton. Because although he's been on TV every week, it just seems like they've almost hit that brick wall with the character, the Fiend, and he maybe needs to be reinvented again. But how do you reinvent what you've already reinvented several times over? So my call there would be Bray Wyatt to win. Let's move on to the big one, which is Drew McIntyre versus AJ Styles. Now, there's a lot of conspiracy theories I've seen around. Sheamus is going to stab Drew in the back, cost him the belt, and AJ is going to win, immediately followed by The Miz winning the strap by cashing in. Or Drew's going to win with the help of Sheamus, and then The Miz is going to cash in and get the belt, leading to Drew and Sheamus versus The Miz and Morrison. All of those are kind of interesting. I think it makes way more sense for Drew to retain the title, but for there to be some kind of interference. I think Omos, the security guard bouncer character, we've not seen a lot from him, and I certainly don't think putting him in the main match and making him the focal point of the finish just makes a lot of sense. So if he were further along in his development, I certainly would think he could be the reason that AJ Styles wins. But because of the way it is, we do have the option of Drew winning and The Miz cashing in. I think we will get a tease of a cash in, but I don't think we'll have the cash in at this show. Drew will win, and we will have the Scottish World Heavyweight Champion leaving TLC with the belt. At least that's the way I'm looking at it. I haven't been watching WWE this week. Haven't been watching AEW, NXT, Impact, Ring of Honor. I did my last piece for university and decided to take the week off from wrestling. I've been keeping up to date with what's happened. I know what's happened on the shows. I just haven't watched them. And it kind of got me thinking, when you hear the stories about USA are unhappy with the ratings, they're unhappy with how the overall pattern is, it just made me think that the last time we had this level of unhappiness in the product was when the competition disappeared. And when the competition disappeared, it was the death of WCW. And for me, that means I have to go back and look at something from that period. Now, I've already kind of discussed the Invasion pay-per-view at one point on the show. And what I wanted to do this time was almost look at the tail end of the Invasion, because I wanted to see if things really were what we remember. Now, the Invasion pay-per-view was awful. I mean, it was so badly conceived, and they didn't have all the talent they needed, and it was just awful. But Vince kind of pulled this trigger on this alliance angle, and it led to Stone Cold Steve Austin joining as the leader. Now, this show, it took place on November 18th, so 19 years ago and a couple of weeks, 2001, the Greensboro Coliseum in North Carolina. Now, it was also the last Survivor Series produced under the WWF name after that whole little lost match to the Worldwide Fund for Nature. World Wildlife Fund. That's it. World Wildlife Fund. Now, it did mark the end of the Invasion angle, which had dominated WWF since March of that year. Now, with Survivor Series, it was obviously the annual pay-per-view, and it had been produced every November by the WWF since 1987. So this was the whatever incarnation it was, the 15th, 16th. One of the things that's quite interesting was it traditionally was the 5-on-5 format. Now, with 2001 being the 15th event, the 5-on-5 match at this show was the main event, and it was the first time in which the match had any actual stakes attached to it. It was the last Survivor Series to be held before the introduction of the brand extension the following year in March, and Raw and SmackDown would go on to have matches at Survivor Series and bragging rights and various other shows. But this was the first brand versus brand show that we'd had since Invasion. Vince McMahon was originally supposed to be part of the main event, obviously with Shane on the other side, but was replaced by Big Show due to injury. There was also title unification matches between Tajiri and X-Pac, that was advertised, but it was cancelled due to X-Pac being injured and he couldn't compete. To resolve it, they just retired the WWF title right after that show, and they continued with the Cruiserweight Championship lineage instead. Now, let's look at some of the stories that happened at this show, because my perception of this was that this whole period was pretty shoddy, and watching back the show, I didn't feel that at all. I actually felt like this was a very, very well produced card, helped massively by Jim Ross and Paul Heyman, who were incredible on commentary. The animosity between these two that led to the reveal at the end when somebody turned, and obviously the result was what it was. If you haven't seen it, we'll get there in a second. And one of them, either Jim Ross or Paul Heyman, was sat there mouth wide open because they just did not think the result was going to be what it was. It was a much better show than people give this credit for. Now, the dark match, which took place on Heat that night, was Lance Storm, just incredible. And for me, the guy WWE really shat the bed on, Raven. And that was against Albert, Scotty 2 Hotty, and Spike Dudley. Now, bear in mind, Albert and Scotty 2 Hotty are now at the Performance Center training people. So, these guys are in dark matches, and now they're training people. For me, never been a massive fan of Albert anyway. The fact that he's kind of in charge of their development process in many ways is it's shocking for me. Now, I don't like to look at matches as preliminary, but that's kind of the way these are. This is a one-match card. Everything on this card is geared towards the winner-takes-all match at the end. So let's look at some of the other matches. We saw Christian defending the European Championship against Al Snow, and we saw Christian kick through the middle rope into Snow. Christian performed the Unprettier and retained the title. I remember watching this at the time and not really being a fan. Watching it now and really liking it. I think these two had a great match. Strange how your taste changed. I loved Christian's theme music at the time. Now it sounds almost like it's not finished. But a really good opener. This is back in the day when WWF put real effort into putting on an opener at a pay-per-view that was actually going to gain some interest. We were followed that by Regal defeating Tajiri with the Regal Bomb. And one of the things, if you look at reports of this match, they kind of almost ignore the fact that Tori Wilson comes out and William Regal basically does something to her. A lot of the time, you don't want to talk about the male on female violence, but this really made Regal look like a piece of shit. And I thought it was a very, very good way to get him over. The look on his face when Tori ran past him to the ring and he just paused and turned around with blood in his lips and just this look of disgust. That thing that Regal is really good at. I was very, very interested to see where that story was going to go because I'd completely forgot about it in this lengthy period of time since then. We then saw Edge versus Test, which was the US champion Edge versus the IC champion in Test. And we saw Edge roll up for the win. So Test lost the title and it became the unified title. Of course, when they did the brand split, these would all come back again later on. But yeah, watching Test, he wasn't a good talker at all. And Vince really loved him at this point. There were some big hopes for him. And I'm it's sad that he's not here, but at the same time, I think that Vince just loved his size and his body because there was very little beyond that. When you watch this match, the entrance, when Test comes out, there's no reaction, none at all. And that, for me, stuck out quite a lot. We moved to the next match because I thought maybe the fans are just dead after this Edge Test match. After the Regal Tajiri and then the Christian Al Snow, they weren't quite as big and exciting as you'd want from a Survivor Series match. They had paid to come and see Survivor Series and hadn't had any Survivor Series matches. But what we saw was WCW Tag Champions, the Dudley Boys, versus the Hardy Boys in a steel cage match. Stacy Keibler stole the cage door key off the referee, passed Bubba and Diva on a table. Matt prevented a 3D and escaped the cage. Jeff was up on top of the cage and was very close to having unified the titles and decided to do the Swanton Bomb. Missed, went through the table, and that was it, all over. It was one of those, looking at it, I get what they were doing. It was this idea that Jeff's desire to be a thrill seeker was actually costing him, and I think that there could have been a great story there where he cut that side of him out and maybe just did it every now and again, kind of what AJ did when he left TNA. He cut out all the stuff he was doing and just put snapshots of that in, and the fans still love AJ Styles for his in-ring stuff. But he's a much more grounded, very different character to what he was. And I think Jeff Hardy, I think they were trying to go that way with him, showing how risky this stuff was. But it was very cool. Great match. And this is the first match, I think, that genuinely lifted the fans up, which is a shame, because then we went into the Immunity Battle Royal. And the last thing that I remembered of this Immunity Battle Royal was the fact that Test won. I didn't realize Test wasn't meant to be in it. And the idea was that if you won, you wouldn't get fired for at least a year. Which, considering Scotty 2 Hotty was involved in the Immunity Battle Royal, he was seen backstage. He ended up being attacked by Test, and Test just took his place. Didn't realize that's what you could do, but apparently WWE did nothing about it and decided to just let it happen. Test would win and couldn't get fired for 12 months. He was very quickly fired because of various issues. Went out on the Indies and came back with a brand new look and returned to ECW, and actually almost looked like what WWE wanted in the first place when it was WWF, when it was Test. I do think that if he hadn't had any of the drug issues that he had, I certainly think Test would have been a bigger star than he was. I think if WCW had stuck around, I certainly think Test would have likely defected to WCW and would have, I honestly think, based on what they did in WWE, where they had Scott Steiner and Test involved together, I think that would have been a very good story in WCW, particularly because I'm amazed that Scott Steiner ever passed a test. Anyway, Test won that and was immune from being fired. We went into the 6-women six-pack challenge, which was Trish Stratus, Lita, Jacqueline, Mighty Molly, Jazz, and Ivory. And what was cool here was it was pretty much Jazz's first appearance in WWF television. Paul Heyman put her over like she was the Messiah. It was beautiful to watch. And for those who hadn't seen any ECW, I had at this point, thankfully, I'd been able to pick up some DVDs and some videos and seen some of the content that was happening. And I was a big fan of what was going on. I think, obviously, with ECW dying, a lot of these people had nowhere to go, and there was far too many talent out there. But Jazz was somebody who should have been a very, very big wrestler for WWE. Let down perhaps by the fact that there was a very narrow-minded opinion of what a WWE diva was at the time. And that women's championship at the time, Trish Stratus won it. And I think Trish was probably the best fit for what Vince wanted. Although hopefully we've progressed slightly beyond blonde hair and big boobs being the prerequisite for getting that belt. Let's move to the main event. And we actually saw a backstage segment with Vince McMahon. And what he's talking about is about how important it is that the WWF legacy remains, although obviously 6 months later, the company's not even the same name anymore. But he did say, if you guys fail, the fans will never forgive you. And the team was The Rock, Chris Jericho, The Undertaker, Kane, and Big Show versus Stone Cold, Rob Van Dam, Kurt Angle, Booker T, and Shane McMahon. Now, the running theme all night was Vince has been telling everybody on Raw, you cannot trust Stone Cold Steve Austin because he is going to return to the WWF. He's back on our side, and he's going to do it on Sunday. It's going to be 6-on-4. And Shane was saying, this is only really happening because he's trying to get in your brain. Just ignore him. This is nothing. It's not real. It's not important. There was a few dynamics here that kind of happened. So Chris Jericho and The Rock were actually kind of friendly and arguing, and there was just the whole storyline with them. And what we saw was Chris Jericho stabbed The Rock in the back. It looked like Stone Cold was going to pin The Rock and it was going to be a win for WCW. He ended up kicking out. We saw The Undertaker running down, almost in that bodyguard of WWF role that we kind of started to hear he did. And Chris Jericho, for me, this is why I've been saying this for a little while now. Chris Jericho can be great, but how he sold Undertaker here made him look really shitty. I honestly believe Chris Jericho has periods of brilliance, but he also tends to have periods of boo-boo face where he just does not try. And when he walked away with The Undertaker kind of guiding him back, he looked like he couldn't give a shit. And that, for me, really detracted from... They built up this massive stakes. They'd given us this false finish where it looks like Austin's going to win. And then the two referee bumps. So you had Nick Patrick and Earl Hebner both get bumped by the respective wrestlers. And what you had was Austin going for the pin. He couldn't get it. He goes over to try and pick up Earl Hebner. And when he picks him up, down comes Kurt Angle. And we're now thinking, well, The Rock's getting back up. This is clearly going to be Kurt Angle hitting The Rock. He's going to help get WCW everything because he was part of the alliance. The problem was he hit Stone Cold Steve Austin, and that's how it ended. That's how WCW ended, and the alliance was all over. And for me, one of the things that's quite interesting is this was intended to almost be like a restart. So the night after was meant to be, now we're resetting. This is how the company's going to look. Yes, there's going to be some WCW guys coming in, but the vast majority is going to be shunted to the side. And that meant people being sent down to developmental and OVW. That meant people being sent to Deep South Wrestling. It meant people being sent, released or sent home or going working for Heartland, which I believe was still a partner at the time. And what's really interesting for me was that they also brought back Jerry Lawler the next night. They had the WCW title become unbranded, so it no longer had WCW, and it would simply be referred to as the World Championship. Several Alliance members kept their jobs, which was Christian, the Dudley Boys, Rob Van Dam, who were all champions. The Alliance's loss at Survivor Series did kind of throw up some really interesting possibilities. Christian was European champion, Dudley's the tag champion, and Van Dam was the hardcore champion, so they all kept their jobs. Stacey Keibler was able to stay employed due to the fact that she was the valet for the Dudleys. Test won the Immunity Battle Royal. There was also the Kiss My Ass Club, which debuted that night. So that thing that we remember as being incredibly crass started the night after Survivor Series, and I didn't think it was that early. I thought it came a lot after that. Now, the first one to get to join that club was William Regal. He was the Alliance commissioner, and he would have to kiss ass to get it. Now, at the very top of the show, they did fire Paul Heyman, and he was the first Alliance member fired. Heyman lunged at Jim Ross, and the audience were delighted to see Ross actually hit Heyman, which, to be honest, I was as well. He was carted off by security, and they brought back Jerry Lawler to replace him, who had left kind of in support of his partner when she was being fired. But it was kind of interesting because he'd left in February, and he'd worked for XPW with Hulk Hogan and Jimmy Hart, and he'd worked a few shows here and there. And there was some suggestion that he might have been going to WCW as well, because WCW was still obviously alive at that point. Very interesting. Had WCW stayed alive, somebody like Jerry Lawler going in there would have been very credible for them as an announcer, particularly if you got rid of Scott Hudson. But the Alliance co-owners Shane and Stephanie were called to the ring to answer for what they did. Shane accepted his defeat and walked away. Stephanie pleaded for a job, and she was escorted from the ring. What was really funny was Kurt Angle went around backstage portraying himself as the man who saved the WWF, and he wanted to be praised for doing so. And instead, he actually got anger from all the locker room, especially The Rock, who would actually face him in a match that night and beat him. Chris Jericho, who'd been feuding with the Rock in the weeks leading up to it, had actually attacked him to reignite their feud as well. So from that, you had a massive reset of the company. And one of the things that's quite interesting here later on was they also had McMahon announced that they were stripping the WWF Championship from Steve Austin, who'd not appeared at the show, and the intent was to award it to Kurt Angle as a token of thanks. Before he could, he was interrupted by Ric Flair, who returned for the first time since 1993 in January when he got beat by Ric Flair, who told him that Flair said that he had actually bet on the winner last night and said to a surprised Vince McMahon that when Shane and Stephanie sold their stock in the WWF to purchase WCW and ECW, he was the consortium who had bought the stock, and as such, he was the co-owner of the WWF. You can see how this reset was used to start all of these stories, and that Ric Flair, Vince McMahon storyline would lead to the brand split, which actually had Ric Flair awarded Raw and Vince McMahon awarded SmackDown. There is so much that you could talk about with this, but the reason I wanted to talk about this reset is because I saw this phrase come up this week when some wrestling journalists were talking about the rumor that WWE are treating the Royal Rumble as a reset. Just remember, this was only 2 years ago. We saw the entire McMahon family standing in the ring telling us that they were sorry for how bad the product had become. Now we're at a point 2 years later where we've had some moments of genius, some brilliant storytelling, we've had some character development that's been really good, but overall people are still pissed that the product's really poor. And I think there's very little you can do by just tweaking characters. When it comes to a reset, they're going to have to be brave and bold. People think that killing WCW was not a good thing. It was a step leading towards something. And I think WWF had to take a big step in 2001 when it came to ending the existence of WCW. There were plans in place to have WWF versus WCW with Shane taking over the WCW element of the company. The problem is that I don't think Vince McMahon is now of an age where he has the fight to do those bold things. We could, in light of the fact that we're seeing some of the McMahons selling their shares, I'm not saying they're going to sell out completely, but we could see the arrival of some new shareholders, some cause to push the company in a different direction. I certainly think that the rumors that we keep hearing, things like Disney Corporation buying the WWE brand, that would be adding that into their portfolio, which already includes things like Star Wars and several other franchises that would shock you. WWE need to make a big, bold move, and it's not simply a case of turning somebody heel and trying to change the announce team like they did before. They need to be brave. They need to be bold. What could they do that would change the future of the WWE? I, for one, know several things you could do. Removing the third hour of Raw, making it less filler, adding perhaps that extra hour onto the network for those hardcore fans that really want to watch it. That makes sense. But they won't do it because it's a lot of money that USA Network are paying. I think USA would see their network ratings rise because there's sections of that show that are unwatchable right now. With SmackDown, some of the storytelling is great. But I don't know about you, but sometimes I watch that show and it's over in a hiccup. It's almost like you don't need to be paying attention to kind of keep up with it. And watching stuff from 2001, I know it's an unfair comparison because we're just come out of the Attitude Era and it's a lot of Attitude Era talent, and we're still treating them with the same goggles that we do for the Attitude Era. But the WWF made this big, bold move and got rid of an entire company with one show. I know they don't want to head down the route of eliminating entire brands now, because I think the ability for Fox to get a separate brand was what they signed up for. But just think about the Immunity Battle Royal at the 2001 Survivor Series, which featured Diamond Dallas Page, who was a former headliner in WCW. Bradshaw, who would go on to be a headliner. Farouk is a former WCW champion. You then look and you have Tommy Dreamer and Raven, who were headliners in ECW. The Hurricane, who was never main event, but was always a huge character and somebody that even looking back years later, my older kids were huge fans of the Hurricane. And even now, my wife is 10 years younger, and I'll tell you now, with producer Zoe Styles, if I ever say, stand back, there's a hurricane coming through, she knows. Of course she knows. Everybody should know the Hurricane. If you don't know the Hurricane, shame on you. But this is the point I wanted to make. This is why, okay, I didn't watch the lowest rated Raw because I don't watch them live anymore. And when I read how bad it was, I thought, you know what? I really don't have the energy to subject myself to this garbage. I know what happened. I don't need to watch any of it. At the same time, I was in the same position in 2001. And whilst everybody else hated the fact that WCW lost and the storyline seemed to just peter out, for me, it felt really exciting because these guys, yes, they could be left without a job, but it's not Vince McMahon's responsibility to give everybody a job. I personally felt it would have been really, really useful if a lot of these guys who'd been leaving WWE had somehow managed to find a company that was setting itself up and they would have the ability to perform for that company. Now, obviously, not long after this period, you would see Perry Saturn, Raven, Chuck Palumbo not long after, Just Incredible, Sean Stasiak, various other talents throughout the company that were underneath that. Mike Sanders, one who I really liked. Sean O'Hare, somebody who, the fact he was never a main eventer was scary, particularly his size and the fact that he combined the size of Test, who Vince was a huge fan of, with the agility of Jeff Hardy, who Vince was a huge fan of. This guy had everything, but WWE didn't have a place for him. That shouldn't have met. I mean, this was a guy who was given Roddy Piper as a manager because they had this idea of making him this oddball character that needed direction. He did need direction, but it wasn't long after this we saw the arrival of TNA, who wanted to create a company that had lots and lots of fresh and exciting matches and talents mixed in with some legends here and there. Sean O'Hare would have been a hugely successful fit in TNA. I think as part of that lineup, Raven, AJ Styles, Ken Shamrock was in for the first little while, Christopher Daniels, Frankie Kazarian, Samoa Joe later down the line. If you added in a Sean O'Hare with the ability that he had, he'd have been a huge fit. The problem was everybody seemed to kind of take their anger out on Vince and WWF at the time and take the stance that they were somehow owed something and that Vince had to fix the industry. I think overall the wrestling industry is, for those who are fans, it seems bigger, but it's not. And you have people like Jim Cornette talking regularly about the fact that the business is contracting. There's less people doing it at a high level than ever before. Yeah, the number amounts for the dollar contracts are getting higher, but so is inflation. So is everything else. The problem lies in you can't just come out and cut a promo and say, we're changing, because they didn't. They then had Mick Foley come out and they did the Dark Arena matches. They added the 24/7 title. These are throwaway concepts that mean nothing. We had Raw Underground, which had the potential to do something, but we didn't quite know what. They're throwing everything at it because they have no ideas left. I will leave you with this point before we leave and let you watch the Christmas special next week. One thing that for me is quite interesting with wrestling fans is they don't like Vince McMahon. It seems to be almost universal. For me, it was the fact that he screwed over Bret Hart. For others, it's the fact that he's holding everybody down. You ever notice the ones who complain about Vince McMahon are the ones who never really achieved anything normally? The ones who actually made money and achieved something invariably may have difficult relations with him, but they also appreciate him a lot. everybody says that Vince McMahon's interfering too much in creative. And yeah, you can understand if scripts are being torn up and rewritten at the last minute, that suggests turmoil like WCW had, and that's steering the ship in a bad way. But there are reports this week that Vince McMahon was not heavily involved in rewriting that show. This means, by and large, the worst show for many people that Raw has ever done, and we'll exclude the 97 show in Germany, which was just pre-taped matches with American commentary. The worst show that WWE have done on purpose had no real interference from Vince McMahon. That tells you the weeks where he has had influence, he knew this stuff wasn't good enough. People have to understand that means that Vince is actually helping the product by and large. At the same time, and equally as important, Vince McMahon has to realize if you have to rewrite your creative team every week, you don't have a creative team. Why don't you just write the show yourself? Vince McMahon can't write a show himself. Hunter cannot write a show himself. Shawn cannot write a show himself. They all have creative teams. The problem appears to be the creative teams. Now, one last little point, and I think this is perfect. Jim Cornette, in one of his shoot interviews, he said one of the things that he hated about WWF, because this is back when this interview was done, one of the things he hated about the WWF was that they would always say, creative has nothing for you. Well, I'm sorry, but if you have Raven signed and under contract and you have nothing for him, that is not Raven's fault. That is the creative team. They've known this for 20 years. The creative team within wrestling does not work. The very idea that you could go the complete opposite way and have the boys booking the boys has been shown not to be successful with the AEW. Somebody needs to find a bold hybrid between the two. And it doesn't involve Jim Cornette. It doesn't involve Vince Russo. It doesn't involve going back 20 years. It involves finding a new creative direction. And that does not involve 20 Hollywood writers who've never seen wrestling.